Well, I think that we probably should get started right away, especially since we are recording this. So those who come in late will have an opportunity to watch the beginning of it again at a later point. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Butler. I'm the director of the Center for Historical Research here at Ohio State University. Welcome to the third installment of our second year in the Anger in History series. And for those of you who haven't been to a Center for Historical Research talk before, the goal of the center is to bring scholars together from a variety of disciplines to examine issues of broad contemporary relevance and historical perspective. Our current series, of which we are in year 2, is Anger in History, and we have had people from all over various disciplines coming in to talk about anger, including we've had anger in philosophy, anger in dance. It's been delightful, and we're perhaps going to get a little bit more serious today, taking a look at anger in the Middle East with Derek Penslar. Now, I wanted to make sure to tell everybody that our next event after this will be January 27th. Deirdre Reiber is going to be coming to talk to us about tracing race, emotion, and belonging in Western self-fashioning from the 15th century in Europe to the 21st century Americas. Our talk today also was sponsored by the Department of History, the Melton Center, the Mershon Center, and the Department of Near Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures. Now, I'd like to introduce to you our moderator for today, Ori Yehudai, who is the Saul and Sonia Schottenstein Chair in Israel Studies here at Ohio State. Over to you, Ori.
Thank you, Professor Butler. It's great to be here. I'm not going to take too much time because we're all looking forward to hearing the lecture. I want to say that we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of the lecture. So if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please try to keep your questions as clear and focused as you can, but please do send us your questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Derek Penslar, who is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. His books include Jews and the Military, a History, which came out in 2013, Theodor Herzl, the Charismatic Leader, which came out in 2020, with a German edition in 2022, and Zionism and Emotional State, which came out last year. This is only a partial list of his many books. He's currently writing a book titled The War for Palestine, 1947 to 1949, A Global History. He's the past president of the American Society for Jewish Research, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and an honorary fellow of St. Anne's College at Oxford. His lecture today is titled Righteous Anger as a Political Emotion, Jews, Arabs, and the Question of Palestine, 1947 to 1949. Professor Penslar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ori, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Sarah, for the initiative behind this wonderful series. Thank you, Bruno, for the invitation as well. And thank you, Laura, for all of the administrative work that makes this all possible. So I'm very grateful to you all. So I'm talking today about anger, which is an emotional response to an unmet desire. Anger is a protest against deprivation. Righteous anger, also known as indignation, asserts the right to that which has been denied to a person. Like other feelings, righteous anger can be scaled up from the realm of individual interaction to that of the collective. In domestic and international politics, the performance of righteous anger anchors an interest group and legitimizes its cause, especially when it is in conflict with other actors. Now, my talk today analyzes the role of righteous anger and its relationship with other negative emotions in Jewish and Arab discourse on the disposition of Palestine between 1947 and 1949. During the debates at the United Nations about the Palestine Question in 1947, Both sides claimed to have been traduced by the international community. Their indignation was a protest against the indignity that had been visited upon them by antisemitism and colonialism, respectively, and which originated in feelings of betrayal and humiliation. Both Jewish and Arab anger were undergirded by these feelings. Humiliation was more prevalent in Arab discourse, given the long legacy of colonialism, which had robbed Arabs of a sense of collective agency. Complaints of betrayal were more common among Jews, who during the interwar period had placed faith in the United Kingdom to fulfill the terms of the Balfour Declaration, only to see Britain disavow the declaration in 1939 and strive to keep Jews out of Palestine thereafter. There was a broader and more profound sense of betrayal among Jews who felt that the promise of emancipation and integration had been obliterated by the Holocaust, as well as wartime and post-war persecution of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. Whoops. There we go. Emotions do not exist in isolation. They form clusters or bundles of sentiments whose intensity and prominence vary consistently. Feelings overlap. They are mutually constitutive. The articulation of feeling in speech, whether in internal monologue or social communication, has produced or produces cascades of overlapping concepts. Negative emotions, that is, those in which an object of desire is perceived as unattained or in danger of slipping away, share common characteristics with fine shades of meaning. Anger itself is a secondary emotion, something produced by a primary sense of loss, threat, or obstruction. It follows upon feelings such as humiliation, shame, betrayal, frustration, envy, and fear. Humiliation, I'll be talking today a lot about humiliation and betrayal. Humiliation arises from being shamed by others and ashamed of oneself. A person who has internalized social values and norms feels guilty for violating those norms. That is, they are aware of their infraction, but they may also feel ashamed, that is, degraded, deprived of self-worth. Self-worth that depends upon adherence to a code of personal behavior is what we mean by honor. Scaling up from individual to collective emotion, the political discourse of colonized peoples has been steeped in shame, humiliation, and the yearning for the restoration of honor. The deprivation of honor, the object of desire, is what creates anger. Again, anger is a secondary emotion. Now let's move to betrayal. Betrayal, according to the Israeli sociologist Nachman Ben Yehuda, is a, quote, violation of trust and loyalty. Betrayal is an action performed by an individual who appears to be loyal and trustworthy, but is not. Betrayal is the act of someone, according to Ben Yehuda, who pretends to be honest and interested, but is in fact manipulative, uninterested, and dishonest. The victim of betrayal is overwhelmed by feelings of anger, distress, fear, and disappointment. The strength of these feelings is proportional to the level of trust and loyalty in which the betrayed party had previously felt towards the betrayer. In international affairs, individuals representing a state or a state-seeking actor can perform a politics of betrayal, accusing another polity in which they had placed their trust, and perhaps their loyalty, of abandoning them out of selfish or otherwise impure motives. Accusations of betrayal are particularly bitter when coming from weaker groups against stronger ones, dependents against protectors. Betrayal is not the act of an indifferent power, but rather one in whom members of another collective had placed trust. And the closer the affective bonds between the two parties, the greater the feeling of betrayal once the bonds are broken. As we shall see, this affective state nicely accounts for Jewish anger against Britain, and by extension against the international community during the 1930s and especially during the 1940s. The 1948 Middle East War deepened all sides' grievances, their feelings of loss, and hence their indignation. As the subsequent history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict has demonstrated, righteous anger is a durable political emotion that can be transmitted across generations. So that's just the sort of methodological introduction about the nature of the emotions I'll be talking about. And now let's apply some of these concepts to the ground. So first, on the Arab world. When Britain handed the matter of Palestine to the United Nations in February of 1947, the representatives of states of the Arab League spoke of Palestine as an integral part of the Arab world. They demanded that it be established as an Arab state. They were incredulous and indignant that the United Nations, an organization dominated by colonial powers, would assume the authority to intervene in Palestine's natural path towards independence. The umbrella group of Palestinian political parties, the Arab Higher Committee, boycotted the United Nations inquiries. Nonetheless, in July of 1947, members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, met in Geneva with the Palestinian leader Musa Alami, and in Beirut with political and diplomatic figures from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And here are three of the most prominent. All of these men, and they were men, demanded statehood for what they called the Arabs of Palestine. That was the commonly used term at the time, as opposed to Palestinian. They justified the creation of a Palestinian state via appeals to universal human rights, the principle of sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and the Arabs' historic presence in Palestine. In turn, they depicted Zionism as the handmaid of British and, more recently, American colonialism. And by colonialism here, they meant great power influence, as opposed to, say, settlement colonialism, which is something rather different, and that's much more connected with the fate of the Palestinians, their dispossession, and the Nakba. That's not what they talked about. When they referred to colonialism, that concept was not really strongly in their minds. Following a long line of anti-Zionists, the diplomats also denied that Jews constituted a nation and therefore had no right to self-determination. Arab diplomats insisted that Jews were a religious community whose freedom of religious practice would be guaranteed in a Palestinian Arab state. So what we have is an emotional underlay of indignity and anger at the international community, but also one of expectation, anticipation and expectation that justice will be done. And whether one agreed with their arguments or not, they did rest on historical and ethical foundations. But the resentment underlying their arguments, the anger underlying their arguments, did lead to the formation of anti-Semitic views. In other words, rationally based anger, and I'll return to this theme a few times over in my talk. Rationally based anger mutated into irrational hatred. For example, Faris el-Khoury, an eminent Syrian politician and diplomat, told the UN General Assembly that Jews had no claims on Palestine because, he said, 90% of the Jews of Eastern Europe were descended from Germans, Franks, Slavs, and Khazars, without any connection to the ancient Middle East. He was referring here to the so-called Khazar hypothesis that attributes the origins of Ashkenazic Jewry to a dubious tale of mass conversion of residents of a medieval Caucasian, that is in the Caucasus kingdom. This was commonly invoked in Arab critiques of Zionism. It remains popular to this day. El-Khoury added that, quote, "The choice of Palestine to satisfy Zionist aspirations was based not on humanitarian sympathy, but on the intention of the Zionists in the United States to launch an economic invasion of the whole Eastern world and to create a bridgehead in Palestine to be the headquarters of their activities. Such a state," he claimed, "would rely on the United States and on the Zionists' co-religionists in the United States, who, quote, had flooded Palestine's Jewish community with dollars to give it symptoms of prosperity." And as fighting broke out in late 1947 and then into 1948, the public rhetoric in the Arab world seesawed between realistic and fantastic assessments of the Zionists' war aims and methods. In January of 1948, the Austrian ambassador in Ankara spoke of moderate Arabs who were willing to accept partition, but they feared, and rightly enough as it turned out, that Jews would infiltrate territory allocated by the United Nations to the Arab state. In May of 1948, however, the Jordanian ambassador to Ankara said that Palestine's Jews planned to infiltrate the entire Levant and that Arab Legion troops had found maps of Palestine and Iraq together, proving Zionist intentions to construct a vast Middle Eastern empire. A similar toggling between anger and hatred, between accuracy and baleful myth, characterized pamphlets submitted in 1948 by the Arab Higher Committee and the Arab League to the United Nations. Both pamphlets accused Zionists of barbaric and intentional cruelty towards the Arabs of Palestine. Zionist actions, such as the notorious massacre of about 100 Arab civilians in the village of Deir Yassin in June of 1948, appeared to justify such accusations. In this spirit, an announcement about the massacre from the Egyptian embassy in Vienna had claimed that, quote, the true purpose of Zionism is the complete annihilation of the Arab element in these territories, meaning in Palestine. But the pamphlets from the Arab Higher Committee and the Arab League went even further. They claimed that Jews were eternally and preternaturally violent. Quote, their cold-blooded and well-calculated Zionist plan for the massacre of populations was a renewal of the technique adopted for them when they first entered Palestine about the year 1400 BC. Zionist savagery, according to the Arab Higher Committee, reflected a long-standing status of the Jewish people as, quote, international intriguers, controllers of the channels of propaganda in important countries. Jewish global power, they claimed, embodied in the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and I'm quoting, had enabled the construction of a totalitarian, fanatic, and terrorist community in Palestine, employing means of violence equaled only by the Nazis. Again, this is a quotation from the pamphlet. The Arab Higher Committee went so far as to claim that Jews were crucifying Arab prisoners. So this language reflects an irrational hatred, informed by a deep-seated fear, stoked by the United Nations' approval of the partition of Palestine in November of 1947. As Muhammad Ali Adrawi has written, on the day after the passing of the resolution, the Syrian education minister, Munir Ajilani, spoke of, quote, the liberation of Palestine and the conservation of Arabism in spite of the great world conspiracy against us. Ajilani feared what he called an impending catastrophe, or Nakba, for Syria and the entire Arab world. Shortly thereafter, Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, described Palestine as the Muslim world's, quote, first line of defense. And 2 years after Israel's creation, he described the state as the product of a Jewish conspiracy against the Arab world and Islam alike. Now, the application here of the term Nakba to the entire Arab world, rather than just the Palestinians, is telling. What became known in later decades as the onset of the Palestinian Nakba, their dispossession from their homes and their homeland, had a different meaning during and immediately after the 1948 war. When Konstantin Zereg employed the term Nakba in his booklet from 1948, The Meaning of Catastrophe, he employed it to depict the disunity, backwardness, and weakness of the Arab world, as opposed to the alleged towering strength and fortitude of the Zionist enemy. Zereg's anger was directed primarily towards the Arab states for their inability to rise to the challenge and defeat the Zionist foe. A zealous proponent of political pan-Arabism, Zereg saw Israel as the greatest threat to the creation of a powerful, vibrant, and healthy united Arab polity. He worried that if under the current circumstances a Jewish state were created, quote, the Zionist danger will gradually permeate our sickly, worn body with a cancerous taint, and one day we will wake up and lo, all of Palestine will be in the hands of the energetic, militant Zionist minority. Even more worrisome, Zereg claimed in a radio broadcast from the end of May 1948, The facility that the Zionist forces have for growth and expansion will place the Arab world forever at their mercy and will paralyze its vitality and deter its progress and evolution in the ladders of advancement in civilization. That is, if the Arab world is allowed to exist at all. We struggle simply to defend ourselves against a treacherous aggression and to protect our very existence. This fear was stoked by propaganda, but the line between manipulation and sincere belief was blurry. Shortly after the Deir Yassin massacre, Hussein Fakhri al-Halidi, secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, directed the Arabic service of the Palestine Broadcasting Corporation to depict the atrocities in the most gruesome terms, including descriptions of the rape of women, which he knew did not in fact occur. Al-Halidi hoped that lurid narratives about Jewish atrocities would bolster the Palestinians' determination to fight the Zionist enemy and would dissuade them from fleeing the country. The opposite was the case. Both Arab and Zionist propaganda intensified Palestinian fears for their lives and accelerated Palestinian flight. Even if Arabs at times intentionally exaggerated the Jews' malevolence, that malevolence as such was taken for granted. That is, in 1947 and 1948, Arab fear and hatred of Zionists in Palestine was entangled with a fear and hatred of Jews as such, and Jews across the ages. The refrains from Zereik's book were continuously heard throughout the Middle East in the late 1940s. Intriguingly, though, the Palestinians were relatively minor players in Zereik's narrative. In his mind, the Nakba was that of the Arab world, more than that of the Palestinian refugees. And in 1949, an English-language article by Musa Alami combined Zereik's arguments about the failure of the Arab nation and the need for Arab unity, the Zionists' talents for total war, and Zionist plans for territorial expansion and regional domination. He did make some references to the plight of the Palestinian refugees, but not much. In some ways, his article was very different from what would become a later and standard Arabic narrative of the war. He made no reference to the return of refugees, a fundamental demand made by Arab states upon Israel at the Lausanne Conference in 1949. And moreover, Alami's anger was really directed largely against the Arab governments for, as he put it, not allowing the refugees of Palestine to work in the states to which they had fled. And he was angry with them for, quote, imprisoning them, that's his language, in refugee camps. So we have here an expression by Alami and by Zereik that expresses anger towards Arab states because they have not fulfilled the needs of the Palestinian people. For both men, the anger against the Arab world, born of frustration, differed vastly from a hatred of Israel. Hatred is a feeling of antipathy so great that the hated object must be excluded from one's life as much as possible or destroyed altogether. Anger is labile and ephemeral, but hatred is enduring. In the Arab world, both anger and hatred were intertwined with a profound sense of humiliation over the loss of Palestine as the culmination of centuries of colonial subjugation. Now, so far I've been talking about negative emotions in public Arab discourse about Israel. The writings of the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser provide an opportunity to compare public and private assessments of the Jewish state made by the same individual. In 1955, Nasser's memoirs from the war, during which he served as an officer, were published in the Egyptian weekly Acher Sa'a. A version of the text was translated into English and published as a pamphlet titled The Truth About the Palestine War in May of the following year. Now, the material in the pamphlet differs in key places from the previously published version. It appears to have been amplified, tailored, or even fabricated for public consumption. For example, the pamphlet ends with an encounter at Fallujah between Nasser and an Israeli officer, the latter dripping, quote, conceit, end quote, but then assuming a humble posture and asking Nasser to allow the Israelis to retrieve their dead on the other side of the line of battle. This story does not appear in the first published memoir. The memoirs published in 1955 and the pamphlet from 1956 do agree on one overarching point, that the Egyptian army did not lose the 1948 war. Rather, it was not allowed to win, and for, quote, political reasons. Similar to Zurayk, Nasser gave his readers every reason to excoriate King Farouk's regime for not pursuing the war with vigor and all the means at its disposal. The publication of the memoirs, and even more so of the pamphlet, were designed to prepare the Egyptian people for a second round of fighting against Israel, in which this time Egypt would prevail. Now, our understanding of Nasser's view of Israel is complicated, though, by the publication in 2020 of Nasser's real-time war diaries by his daughter, Hoda Nasser. Published in France under the title Nasser, Archives Secrètes, the diaries present a very different image of Egypt's performance during the war, and more important, of Nasser's interpretation of Egypt's performance and his affective position regarding that. On October 27, 1948, Nasser wrote in his diary of the Egyptians, quote, shoddy command and incompetence as the prime source of the catastrophe. Over the course of the major Israeli offensive against the Egyptian forces, known as Operation Yoav, there is no mention in the diaries of what was described later in the memoirs and the pamphlet as a, quote, political war. Moreover, on October 28th, he wrote, quote, the Jews are 1,000 times better than us, end quote. At first, he writes, they had only hunting rifles, but, quote, they've developed a considerable army, an air corps, an armored corps, an infantry equipped with mortars, heavy artillery. Nasser's description of an actual face-to-face meeting with the Israelis on October 31st is far removed from the abrasive encounter he described in the pamphlet. Quote, the Jewish commander arrives in an armored vehicle, bearing a white flag. I go to meet him. He demands our surrender. We refuse. Then he asks to recover the remains of his soldiers killed in combat. There is no mention here of conceit or humble supplication. 10 days later, he describes negotiations between Egyptian and Israeli command at Gat. Quote, here, now he's talking about the Israelis, here one has the sense of being surrounded by truly civilized people. Everything's clean. The farm machinery is mechanized. The women are elegant. They wear shorts. The negotiations progress smoothly, and the Egyptians depart, quote, but not with having been offered orange juice, oranges, sandwiches, chocolate, petit four, and cookies. So in the retelling of his experience in the war in later years, Nasser imagined an alternative scenario in which Egyptian honor is restored, and it is the Israelis, not the Egyptians, who are humiliated. Now, there is, of course, in this story more than a hint of betrayal, that of the Egyptian people by their own government. But anger over this betrayal is secondary to the humiliation caused by the Israelis' superior fighting skills and professionalism. The fact that Nasser's own personal experience was not one of intentional humiliation by Israelis had little bearing on his understanding of the encounter after the fact, or perhaps a need to fabricate a story of humiliation that would appeal to a large public. So again, the difference between emotions as they may have been experienced in real time and emotions as they were remembered or perhaps reconstructed or fabricated for political purposes some years later. So that's about the Arab world. Let me turn to the Jewish world now. A different affective valence characterized Jewish anger during the years leading up to and during the 1948 war. Now, just to give a bit of background, immediately after Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, and for many years thereafter, Zionists often discussed Britain with a language of gratitude, an expression of thanks that acknowledges dependence of a weaker power upon a stronger one. But after the 1929 riots in Palestine and the issuing of the Hope-Simpson White Paper, bitter rhetoric from Jews accelerated dramatically, with a language of frustration and distress giving way to a most undiplomatic fury. The prominent Zionist Alfred Mond, that is Lord Melchett, accused His Majesty's government of, quote, a grotesque travesty and betrayal that called into question the sacrifice of British Jews during the Great War. A week later, a protest meeting in Manchester declared the white paper to be, quote, a betrayal of British honor. 6 years later, the Peel Commission's partition proposal, which would have awarded to Jews a state in less than a fifth of Western Palestine, was seen by many Jews as a cynical act of British imperialist strategy. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise of the United States called the proposal, quote, deeply violative of British obligations, quote, the greatest betrayal of a most sacred trust. And if I haven't said the word betrayal enough, he and the American Zionist leader Jacob de Haas co-authored a pamphlet on the situation titled The Great Betrayal. That word betrayal was omnipresent in reactions to the May 1939 British White Paper, which abandoned the terms of the Balfour Declaration and replaced it with the proposed unitary Arab-Jewish states. There were calls among Jews throughout the United States for protest rallies to express indignation against this betrayal. The Philadelphia Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Exponent, summed up the ambient emotional temperature nicely. There is only one thing that is worse than being beaten by an enemy, and that is being betrayed by a friend. Too bad that England should have chosen to play this damnable part in one of the darkest periods in all of Jewish history. Now, all of that precedes the immediate years immediately before the establishment of the State of Israel. By the time we get to 1945 and beyond, those feelings of having been betrayed increase exponentially. Fury at the perpetrators of the Holocaust extended to those who kept their distance and did nothing to prevent or mitigate it. Britain was a target for vitriol because of its throttling of Jewish immigration to Palestine, seizing refugee ships approaching Palestine, and sending their passengers to detention camps and their crackdown on Zionist militants. In 1948, American Jewish leaders frequently presented the Zionist struggle for a Jewish state as one against British imperialism. During the first half of the year, the Jewish press routinely accused the British of harboring anti-Zionist and pro-Arab sympathies. According to one editorial in the Detroit Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, the British were a greater enemy than the Arabs. The Jewish newspapers also attacked the American government for many reasons, such as ordering American citizens in Palestine to turn in their U.S. passports, or taking punitive actions against those who would fight for the Jewish state, declaring an embargo on the sale of arms to the State of Israel, or to what would become the State of Israel, or backing away from support for partition in the winter of 1948 in favor of a UN trusteeship. Although the State Department and unnamed, quote, oil interests were the most frequent objects of attack, even President Truman himself was not spared. So just a tremendous outpouring of anger is probably too strong a word, but really vitriolic frustration, disappointment, fury at the American government, at the government that American Jews themselves are obliged to, and yet a sense of freedom, actually, as well, which is very interesting, a sense of freedom to be as unrestrained as they were. In February, the Boston Jewish newspaper, The Advocate, commenting on the American government's retreat from partition, declaimed that, and please forgive my language, this is coming from the newspaper, what is going on in Palestine is the rape of a UN decision, which was reached with moral support. The Boston paper excoriated the United States for engaging in, quote, treachery, catastrophe, and moral insolvency. A month later, a Jewish journalist based in Detroit named Nathan Ziprin wrote of American policy, the hurt is too deep, the wound is too painful, the insult too heavy, the betrayal too unbelievable. The United States stands with the Arabs in shearing Jewish hopes, in subjecting the men, women, and children in Palestine to slaughter by semi-civilized peoples, that's his language, and in frustrating a dream which stood as a pillar of light in Jewish life over the centuries. In April, according to an editorial in the Chicago Jewish Sentinel, Palestine was in the same position as the Warsaw Ghetto 5 years previously. Palestine's Jews would either die en masse or, quote, write a new and glorious page in the development of democracy. Which scenario would occur, according to the newspaper, lay in the hands of the American Jewish people, who were called upon to give tirelessly of themselves and their resources. A Detroit lawyer and Jewish activist named Balfour Peisner described Palestine under British rule as a police state no better than Nazi-occupied Europe. Boris Smolar, who you see here on the slide, was another widely syndicated and influential Jewish journalist at the time, who noted in October that Jews were irritated with both of the presidential candidates in that year, Thomas Dewey and Harry Truman, and that Israel, and by extension American Jews, had no choice but to look after themselves. The implied message was that American Jewry would stand by Israel regardless of the American government's actions or desires. The Jewish press featured a notable absence of the gratitude towards Britain that had been abundant after the promulgation of the Balfour Declaration and its endorsement by American President Woodrow Wilson. When America did support the partition resolution, and even when the United States recognized Israel, the first state to recognize Israel, in May of 1948, such acts elicited only occasional expressions of thanks to the Truman administration. Gratitude towards the United Nations was even harder to come by. The world had changed enormously since the early days of the British Mandate, when Zionists routinely compared the Balfour Declaration to Magna Carta, an acknowledgement of human rights and liberties, and an act of benevolent and royal grace. In the wake of the Holocaust, the need for a Jewish state appeared urgent, apparent, and a matter entirely of right, and not, as it had been previously, a blend of right and privilege. Failure to acknowledge that right was a source of unequivocal moral condemnation by American Jewish activists. Oh, perfect. Now, I've been framing my remarks around two discursive patterns emerging from the expression of anger, one centered around humiliation and one around betrayal. I'm going to add now a reference to a third kind of anger, or a combination of annoyance and existential fear, which is an unusual combination, but as I said at the beginning, emotions bundle together in the most fascinating ways. And it's what characterized American Jewish discourse in 1948 regarding the Palestinian refugees. Now, it's interesting that during the first months of the 1948 war, the American Jewish press expressed very little in the way of negative feelings towards the Arabs of Palestine. Many stories emphasized Jewish or Arab desires for coexistence. In February, a cartoon printed in a number of Jewish newspapers depicted the Palestinian leader, Amin al-Husseini, here labeled the Mufti, armed with a rifle, physically quite threatening looking. He didn't look at all like that. Armed with a rifle, physically placing himself between a seated Bedouin and a Western-dressed young male Zionist. According to the Detroit Jewish newspaper, the Arab fighters killed in Palestine in early 1948 were not Palestinians, but invaders from Syria. The Palestinian Arabs, the paper wrote, were peaceful and did not want war. Even when the paper offered a grim assessment of the military threat facing the future Jewish state, Palestinian Arabs were described as, quote, a loose mass of individuals juxtaposed against the highly organized Jews. In December, the Boston Jewish Advocate claimed that the Haganah was deployed to protect parts of Palestine where Jews and Arabs lived amicably, and would implement mutual defense agreements between Arab and Jewish communities to staunch both violence and flight. According to the Chicago Jewish Sentinel, the custodian of absentee property, an individual who had been appointed in Israel, would protect the property of Arabs who fled the country under the pressure of Arab propaganda. At the end of the hostilities, according to this newspaper account, the custodian would return to the Arabs not only their land, but any profits gained by temporary Jewish usufruct. For the Chicago Jewish Sentinel, it was, quote, a cardinal point of Israeli policy to welcome the Arab refugees back to their homes. Months of hard fighting in the winter and early spring of 1948 between Palestinian militias and Jewish forces did not change this fundamentally charitable language. Even after the multi-state Arab invasion of Palestine in May, Jewish discourse on the Palestinian Arabs remained remarkably free of fear or anger, let alone hatred. When the first United Nations imposed truce went into effect in June, the Philadelphia Jewish exponent gushed that the Haganah had no temptation to acquire by force those sections of Palestine, historically Jewish, which in its wisdom the UN saw fit to assign to others. In that same month, the Chicago Sentinel wrote that Jews never dreamed of an all-Jewish state, and that Jews and Arabs in Israel could have lived together in peace if the local Arabs had not been manipulated and coerced by their leaders, especially Amin al-Husseini. So when did things change? After the second round of Arab-Israeli fighting in July of 1948, the language of compassion and mercy in the American Jewish press began to blend with, and ultimately shifted to, one of toughness and decisiveness. The newspapers began to write of a population transfer, with Palestinian Arabs going to Arab lands and Jews from the Middle East coming to Israel. The American Jewish press appears to have been echoing rhetoric coming from Israel, as by early August, statements about the refugees that had previously been made only in confidential government meetings were now uttered in public. So, for example, this is really one of the very early statements where this is now the foreign minister, Moshe Shertok, later Sharet, speaking to Volker Bernadotte, the UN mediator, about the fact that the Palestinian refugees will not be allowed to return. In early August, the diplomat Abba Eban, formerly Aubrey Eban, said that the Arab states would need to take care of the Palestinian refugees, just as Jews would provide for Jewish ones. And Moshe Sharet said that barring a formal peace agreement with Arab states, readmitting the refugees would be dangerous, even though the Palestinian Arabs had fled due to external forces for which, he said, they were not responsible. An earlier spirit of compassion still lingered in the United States. On August 12, 1948, an editorial in the Boston Jewish newspaper assured readers that although the Arabs and British both bore responsibility for Arab flight, their homes were intact, and that although their fields were being plowed by Israel's fighting men, the Arabs could, quote, look forward to a resumption of their normal lives by the time that hostilities end. Another editorial titled The Quality of Mercy in the Detroit Jewish newspaper exuded sympathy, declaring that Jews, of all people, would appreciate the Palestinian tragedy. The editorial assured Palestine's Arabs that they were not unwanted in Israel, that their homes and businesses were secure, that they could and should go back. More often than not, however, from around the middle of August in 1948, American public opinion, or American Jewish public opinion, turned against the refugees. Boston's Jewish newspaper asserted that Arabs had fled en masse from the Galilee without reason, and said nothing about letting them back. By this time, Seymour Tilchin of the Detroit Jewish Chronicle had lost all sympathy for the refugees. He called their flight as unnecessary as it was incriminating. It was caused by the machinations of Arab politicians, not fears of the Jews. The lucky Arabs, he wrote, were those who had stayed behind, enjoying high wages and health care. The Chicago Sentinel writer Morris Bromberg also now blamed the Palestinians for their fate, writing that if they'd only stayed, they would have enjoyed civil liberties and minority protection. Over the course of 1948, then, from mid-August onward, the public voices of American Jewry became increasingly shrill, angry at the Palestinian refugees, not for acts of violence against Israelis, although those certainly took place, nor for their opposition to Jewish statehood. Israel had been created, it had defeated the Arab armies, it had expanded its territory beyond that which was accorded to it by the United Nations. But the government did not want the refugees, and American Jews, by and large, supported Israeli government decisions unquestioningly. There was, however, something else at work. Already in April of 1948, a publication by Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, had mused darkly that Palestine's Arabs had been ordered to flee by their leaders with promises of Jewish property when they returned to their land following an Arab victory. The story gained currency later in the year and has remained popular among Jews for decades thereafter. The Israeli government itself began to publicly propagate this view in the early 1950s. I do not know if they disseminated it earlier, but they certainly did. Here we see a pamphlet of 1953, which represents the kind of now the Orthodox view, or the Orthodox view as of the early 50s, about Arab-ordered Palestinian flight. But I first see it in American sources, again, in 1948. Why is it so important? The story of intentional Arab migration served to make the Palestinians accessories before the fact, as co-conspirators in the Arab plan to liquidate the young state of Israel. It removed culpability from Israel for the Arabs' mass flight, confiscating their property and prohibiting them from returning to their homes. From this perspective, allowing the Palestinians back would threaten the survival of the new Jewish state, as those same Arabs whose flight was a testimony to their evil designs on Israel would henceforth constitute a dangerous fifth column. After 1948, American Jewish language about the refugees continued to remain free of expressions of hatred, but it did express profound fear of the consequence of their return, along with, and this is what I find so fascinating about some of the quotes I read earlier, no small amount of pique at the Palestinian Arabs for having listened to their leaders, for having left in the first place, thereby creating a refugee problem that the world used as a pretext to attack the state of Israel. Like they're angry at the Palestinian refugees for having created a refugee problem, which is now a PR problem and a political problem for Israel. These views were riddled with contradictions. But as I said at the outset, emotions do not exist in isolation, and they build upon each other. Anger, as we've seen, can be a product of feelings of shame and humiliation, or grief and a sense of betrayal, or fear of the loss of a precious object of desire. All three of these varieties have continued to flourish in the realm of political communication and public opinion over the long history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And by way of conclusion, I want to relate the story I've told today about 1948, then to the present. Since last October 7th, Palestinians and their supporters have intensified a long-standing critique of Zionism as exclusionary, hierarchical, racist, built upon the erasure of Palestinians by either ethnic cleansing or subordination as a powerless minority, be they citizens, as they are in the State of Israel, or disenfranchised victims of occupation, as in the West Bank. Protests at universities throughout North America have been charged by powerful displays of negative emotion, anger at the American government for arming Israel, and university administrations for refusing to divest financially from Israel, and scorn, which is an emotion just north of hatred, for Israeli students by dint of their nationality, regardless of their actual views on the current crisis, and for Jewish students who do not explicitly disavow Israel. This emotional matrix is not all that different from what we encountered in 1948. Now, it's true that the discourse of humiliation began to recede in the Arab Middle East following Egypt's successful blows against Israeli forces in the Sinai during the early days of the 1973 war, and even more important with the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization to international prominence over the course of the 1970s. As the PLO grew more assertive in the international arena, it increasingly employed the language of human and collective rights rather than seeking redress for humiliation. And that trend has continued to our own day, when Palestinian demands are more for life itself, both for the individual and the collective, rather than abstract honor. Nonetheless, the so-called Al-Aqsa flood, as the October 7th massacre is called in much of the Arab world, has been portrayed as an ennobling display of Palestinian strength with an affective significance that transcends its alleged geopolitical value. And Israel, for its part, has since 1948 often perceived the international community as arrayed against it. A Zionist discourse of international betrayal has indeed faded, but only because Israel and its supporters worldwide have expected so little from outside parties. In keeping with the earlier discussion of the relationship between dependence, gratitude, and betrayal, the main object of Israeli accusations of betrayal has been, counterintuitively, the United States, Israel's closest ally and supplier of 70% of its arms imports. Since October 7th of last year, Israeli public opinion has zigzagged between heartfelt gratitude towards the Biden administration for providing arms and anti-missile arrays to Israel and accusations of betrayal, when the American administration has attempted to pressure Israel to moderate its tactics. If anger were the primary manifestation of the current politics of humiliation and betrayal, there would be more possibilities for peace between Israel and Palestine. Because anger, as I've pointed out now throughout, is a labile feeling that responds to gestures that in turn respond to unmet needs. For both sides, however, anger has long ago petrified into hatred. And since October 7th, hatred has, like molten lava, transformed into rage. Before the conflict can even approach a resolution, it must be restored to the relatively flexible state of competing forms of anger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for this quite powerful presentation. I want to remind our audience that we're waiting to receive your questions. We will be delighted to discuss your questions. In the meantime, I can start with maybe with my own question. And I wanted to start with a question about theory or methodology. So you discussed the change over time in how emotions or the description of emotions change over time or evolve over time. So you discussed this in the context of the of Nasser's memoirs and also in the context of the meaning of the Nakba. So we have a difference between emotions in real time and in later periods. Can you talk a little bit about how this, about your thoughts about that in terms of the study of emotions, how this this phenomenon of emotions changing over time, how does it influence the study of emotions?
Well, it's a really excellent question. It's a challenge for a historian to answer because we're not therapists and we don't spend years with our patient, as it were, week after week, getting to know them and seeing through their subterfuges and their acts of self-deceit. So we have texts, right? We have written texts that we try to decipher. In the case of Nasser, it's pretty clear that he is, after all, a politician, and he's trying to create a public discourse to mobilize a population for war. So whether he's convinced himself that he believes this account that he creates in 1955 and 56, I can't say. Maybe he does. Human beings are very good at convincing themselves of what they want to believe. One thing I found also in terms of human beings, that human beings often, it's hard to say they're lying because they're speaking an untruth that they might believe. The other is the, I think, very complex relationship between manipulation and sincerity. This is something I've come across quite often in my work, that it's very easy to think about elites manipulating a public, and I'm sure that happens, but the elites themselves might believe what they're saying, but also the public must have some kind of responsive chord that is waiting for and will benefit from or will respond to, right, the emotional message. So I try to think of emotion more in terms of vectors that are either lateral, that they move from top to bottom, bottom to top. They're circular rather than purely manipulative. And I think of emotional memory as something that's quite fluid, and it can change quite a bit. You know, we might think that we have a memory of how we felt in reaction to a certain event from 5, 10, 20 years ago, but of course we have no idea of recreating that. We have the texts as historians, which are not ephemeral. but we have to create a certain interpretive framework. And in the case of these texts, sometimes it's fairly obvious, like the Jewish text from 1948. And there's so much of it, and it's so repetitive. And, you talk about, so I feel pretty confident talking about a politics of betrayal. But this is why you have to do, I think, when you do emotions history, either you have to do a kind of high intellectual history where you're looking at one individual in great depth, or a prosopographical approach, or very wide ranging, where you're looking at a vast amount of textual material, like, the press or something, and you just, something that perhaps I have not worked myself with, big data, but something where you do vast amounts of searching for certain phrases or whatever, because otherwise you can't really know if you're talking about a widespread emotional discourse or if it's just a fluke.
Thank you. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
I was wondering, what made you turn to emotion as the lens through which to see this whole era of history in the first place? And how much do you think it's changed the way that you look at the beginnings of this whole era?
What's funny, the real reason is, I'm afraid, a bit anticlimactic. It's sort of happenstance that I was supposed to write a comprehensive history of Zionism or an interpretive history of Zionism, and I didn't really have a hook. I was just going to write something more synthetic, and then I had a random conversation with an Oxford colleague over lunch. This is why people should eat lunch with each other and not at their desks. And he was working on emotion and international relations. And I said, "Oh, that sounds like fun. I'd never heard of that." And he sent me some of his articles and his book, and I really liked it very much. And I began teaching courses in the history of emotions because I thought it actually explained something about modern social and political movements that was missing. And then I centered a book around that, my last book. And then I thought I would write a global history of the 1948 war that would be much more high diplomatic in its structure. And that is a component of the book. But I'm finding the more and more I get into the sources that the historical, emotional, whatever methodology from the previous book actually works very well this time around as well. Because ultimately, we can't understand political events, social movements through the lens of organization alone. It's certainly not through the lens of coherent abstract ideology alone. I need only refer to certain developments in the United States that require, I think, understanding of emotion, and not simply a throwaway comment about emotion representing the irrational, or because all cognition and all emotion are completely intertwined with each other. So our most basic thought processes are shot through with emotion. And so this helps us understand so much better really how anything happens in the political arena. I should just say, by just real quick conclusion, I am limiting myself here, though, to political emotion. That is emotion that is expressed publicly in a public arena in which your well-being is associated with that of a polity, of a collective. I'm not talking about individual love, individual anger. I'm not writing a book about people who love or hate other human beings so much as the abstraction they have developed of the nation, the state, the people, and their emotional relationship to that. So I'm very specifically limiting myself to political emotion.
Well, let me say how much I appreciate you pointing out that we experience emotions as a bundle, that it's never just one emotion at a time, things overlap. I mean, I think that's a really useful perspective.
So we do have another question on the sort of longer term impact or emotions after the event. So I'm reading the question: why is the anger still there 75 years later? Lots of people were mishandled after the Second World War, but many have gone to other things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So take it from that perspective for just a second. The post-World War II era is one of tremendous dislocation and trauma. The trauma of partition of the subcontinent, with 12 million or 10 to 12 million people losing everything, their property, their homes, perhaps 1 million dying, the uprooting of the ethnic Germans in East Central and Eastern Europe, again, over 10 million people. Why is it that this issue has not been resolved, really? Because it's the fact that it hasn't been resolved that leads to these ongoing feelings of I'd say not just anger, but the irrigation of anger into hatred, rage, and so forth. It's like a flood. As I've written somewhere, all conflicts create emotional waves, but Israel-Palestine creates tsunamis. So the question is why? Well, I think that for Israel, there's an ongoing sense of vulnerability that nothing really since 1948 has quelled. That is, for some Israelis, there was a period in the 1990s where there was a hope for normalization and a sense that that vulnerability might fade. But there was a substantial percentage of the Israeli population during the so-called Oslo era that was not buying it and did not believe it. And for Israel, I think the underestimated factor that has led to the ongoing anger, vulnerability, and now all-out rage was the Second Intifada, whose impacts on Israeli society have, I think, sometimes been neglected. And the Israel of 2024 is, after all, the Israel of the children of the Second Intifada. So the anger, the vulnerability, and now, especially since 2000, much more open and socially accepted expressions of hatred towards Arabs, towards Palestinian Arabs, than was the case earlier in the state's history. And of course, October 7th just was the, as it were, the spark that lit this ongoing, I would say, this huge, bundle of dry twigs or whatever that was Israeli anger. So it's an unresolved trauma, an unresolved trauma from the Holocaust, an unresolved trauma from 1948 and beyond. And for the Palestinians, all the more so, a dispossessed people that, and of course, it's a very complicated question about whether Arab states should have, and I'm using that word should, which is not a historical term, it's a moral term. Should Arab states have done more to integrate Palestinian refugees into their communities? Could they have? All I know is, from a historical point of view, they didn't, and that Palestinian leaders themselves wanted very much to keep the Palestinian cause alive. And it's not only unresolved, it's worsened. I mean, there was the Nakba of 1948, there was the Naksa of 1967, when another 300,000 Palestinians turned into refugees. Decade after decade after decade of struggle, which has led to, well, disaster, catastrophe for the Palestinians. So it's not surprising then that the rage, the anger, the fury have continued, because the conflict itself has been unresolved. Now that begs the question, is there some way that this conflict could have been resolved over the last 76 years? The fact that it hasn't suggests that it would have been very difficult to do so. So I think that's the answer, is that there are certainly interests. There are, among the Palestinian National, for example, movement, I mean, there were many leaders who said, we don't want this conflict to be resolved. We only want this to be resolved through, it was the liberation of Palestine, I think was the term used in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, and then some moderation and language towards a provisional state in the West Bank and Gaza. But the Palestinians did not want this problem to go away. I think that's probably closer to the answer for the Palestinian side. And the Israelis have remained traumatized to this day.
Thank you. We have another question going back to more methodology and theory.
Yeah.
What sources are you using for your various claims, specifically about your claims about bundling emotions?
Right.
And then we can turn to another question, to the other question.
Yeah. Yeah, so sources, like I said, I think that you can do emotions history in a variety of ways. If the kind of classic work, which was Barbara Rosenwein's, was prosopographical. You take a look at a group of medieval thinkers, and so it's a very elite form of history, and that's fine. And you trace their emotional language. But I prefer a broader net. So the kinds of sources I'm using, it's pretty clear that for the first part of the paper, when I'm talking about the Arab world, I'm really talking about elite Arab discourse. Now, what about Arab newspapers? Well, I do actually have a fair amount of information now from Al-Ahram, which was the major Egyptian newspaper from 1948. The problem with the Egyptian newspapers is they are highly censored, and they tell you what the government wants you to hear. But you do know that there's a guiding hand. In the case of the Jewish public sphere, it's much less regulated. So there's all kinds of things. There's rabbinic sermons, right? There are the Jewish newspapers, of which there are scores. There's summer camp brochures. There's just all kinds of texts that are produced, and there's not a whole lot controlling them explicitly, although there are certain emotional norms. And this gets back to an old concept from the 70s about emotionology, about, I think Peter and Carol Stearns coined this term, about normative emotional language. So it's clear that there's certain things that American Jews say about Israel in the 1960s, 80s, even to this day, although it's changing, that are acceptable and certain things that aren't. And it's not just the things you can say in terms of how critical you are about Israel, it's the emotional register you're allowed to display. For example, if you want to be critical of Israel, it's allowed within the norms of American Jewish communal life as long as you are sad and as long as you are speaking from love. If you're speaking from anger and even worse, from rage or hatred, then it's unacceptable. So the emotion is just as important as the actual content. So in the case of the Jewish community, it's very easy. There's a huge body of texts. In fact, there's an endless body of texts that one can read. And especially if it's global, then you're reading texts in many different languages produced from all over the world. So then the problem is not too little material, it's too much. And how do you rein it in? So methodologically, I think that it is no different really from if you were doing a kind of straight cultural history or a history of political thought. Do you want to focus on a narrow elite? Do you want to look at a broader base? One thing I haven't done a whole lot for this project, I did somewhat for my previous book, is archival sources. When you get into archival sources, then you really have to decide how broad a lens or wide a lens you're going to use. So in the case of the journalist Boris Smolar, he left behind, hundreds and hundreds of files of unpublished stuff. So it was really interesting to read him and to get a sense of who he was and where he was coming from emotionally. So you can do that, but if you do it, obviously it's going to narrow your scope quite a bit. And then you might want to focus on kind of classic microhistory. You might want to recreate the emotional universe of another Minuccio, right? So the cheese and the worms, redux. These are all completely legitimate ways of applying the history of emotions methodology with either a very narrow source base or a very wide source base.
And I think maybe we'll return later to sources, maybe and actors that we're studying. But we have another question about sort of more detailed question about concepts and definitions. So if I understood you correctly, the trajectories of anger as humiliation and anger as betrayal are not dialectically related. And then, as I understood, the person who asked the question says, I understood them to be triangulated, at the least.
Look, they're all related. This is the thing. When you talk about negative emotions, which all have something to do with a failure to or an anticipated failure to achieve or to lose an object of desire, the negative emotions are very sticky and they are closely bound up with each other. And the very act of trying to separate them out and to then classify them, this is anger, this is fear, this is betrayal, this is, there is a bit of violence there in the very act of classification. But, taxonomy is violence. I mean, it's a heuristic. So we understand that there's a certain position vis-a-vis power, a certain sense of agency that might help us understand better an emotional politics of shame, humiliation, as opposed to, say, a politics of guilt, which is based on agency and power. So there's very little guilt, say, in the kind of discourse I was talking about in the Arab world, but there's a great deal of shame. So anger is, as I said, also it's a secondary emotion. You're angry because of something else that you feel. So of course they're related, they're triangulated, but no, they are not directly related to each other, because you can be humiliated without being betrayed, and you can be betrayed without being humiliated, even though it's more likely that if you're betrayed, there is some sense of humiliation, because betrayal usually involves a sense of having someone in whom you had great trust and who may have been in some ways your patron, someone who had power over you. And because that person had power over you, you now may indeed feel humiliated. And by the way, that could even be the case in a allegedly equal love relationship between people. You actually have a great deal of power over each other, even if one person is not explicitly superior to the other.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question that asks you to reflect or respond to a speech by Bezalel Smotrich today, but I don't think that you had enough time to
I haven't read it.
yeah,
I can.
read it and reflect it. So
I'm feeling dread, if not, speaking of emotions. But what did he say?
I don't know. Just yeah, there's a question here. I think he said something about I don't know if this is what, yeah, about continuing the war and occupying northern Gaza. I think this is what he said. I don't know if this is what the person that wrote the question refers to, but this is what I saw. But I want to return to again to a discussion of emotions, and maybe so thinking about the different emotions. Do you have any thoughts on how to distinguish between individual and collective emotions, and maybe also the emotions of the public and leaders making decisions, how they relate to each other, how leaders respond to collective or popular emotions, and so on and so forth?
I think that individual emotion can actually be very easily scaled up to the collective level for no other reason than that the same people who feel the emotions towards other people create, or they feel this way also about the collective. Because what other kind of emotional vocabulary do they have? So when people say they love their country, what do they even mean by that? But they're using the word love, or they're saying, I hate Boston Bruins fans or something, So they're using the language of individual emotion. They're applying it to completely different situations, but that's the vocabulary they have. So I think what's probably more useful, rather than trying to divide individual from collective emotion, is to understand that even within individual emotion, it's quite varied. Take love, for example. There are many kinds of love. There's spiritual love, there's companionate love, there's parental love, there's erotic love. The classic Aristotelian division between agape and storge and eros and philia. So when you think about, well, so-called patriotism, what is that? Well, it could be a little bit of each, but it helps you understand it a little better. So when you think about, I think about the way that diaspora Jews feel about Israel, there's an erotic element to it. Certainly classic Zionism, the new Jew, the ideal of the new Hebrew body, bronzed, tanned, muscled, all of that. There's an erotic element. There is a spiritual element, obviously, between Jewish concepts of sacrality and the sacred Holy Land, and so there is a religious element. There's also a weird parental element, that Israel is the vulnerable child that needs our care, but we also look up to it and admire it. So in other words, I think what you do probably to understand that connection is understand how individual emotions are framed, and then see how people apply those individual emotions. And obviously there's something fictitious in this, in that the nation doesn't exist, right? And the states exist because state power institutions exist, but nations don't really exist the way that individuals exist. And yet people think they do. And so they feel about them. And so the other question about leadership, this is really interesting, and something this is why I'm really glad to have had conversations with my colleagues in international relations. The problem is that most people, and maybe actually ironically at Ohio State, it's been a bit different. I remember years ago speaking in, I think it was the same institute, talking to people who work in international relations and work on conflict resolution, leadership, and so forth, that most historians, professional historians, do not deal with elite political leaders. They shun that approach, and they would much rather deal with the voiceless and various forms of social history and the like. But what they're missing is that there is a certain special quality to people who actually become great leaders. So on one level, they are different. Their level of ambition or confidence, or perhaps sociopathy. I mean, one could argue that to become a major political leader, you have to be a sociopath. I mean, I don't mean a psychopath. That would be reserved for a few people. But on the other hand, they have emotions. And they love and they hate and they fear. And they form alliances not only based on interests, but also based on passions. And to try to understand, for example, how a politician or like Harry Truman could both have negative feelings about Jews, which he did. He could also have certain admiration and sympathy for Jews. He also had to think about the electoral map in 1948 and how the Jewish vote was going to fall, Republican or Democrat. But he did have some genuine sympathies for the desires of Jews for a Jewish state. Now, would that in and of itself have been enough to get him to favor partition or to recognize the state of Israel, much to the opposition of his entire advisory team? I don't know. But there was a definite level of sympathy there. And I was just talking with someone yesterday who's something of a Joe Biden expert, that Biden evidently has a genuine sympathy for Israel. And he may have been surprised a bit by the way he was treated over the last year. But so no, politicians have their own feelings, and they're just as variable among politicians as they are among the rest of us. So the intermediate way, though, between politicians not having feelings at all, just acting out of interest or ambition, and having feelings like the rest of us is what my colleague Todd Hall writes about, which is the performance of an emotional politics, which is clearly what they do. You don't even have to think about whether or not they care, they love, they hate. States clearly perform a politics of, let's say, sympathy. And there's an airplane crash in Russia. The American government issues some kind of a statement of sympathy. There is the president of Taiwan makes an outrageous statement about independence of Taiwan. The Chinese government performs rage. They may or may not feel it. They probably do, but they're performing it. So it's signaling. They are signaling an intention. They're signaling flexibility. They're signaling aggressiveness. So in other words, emotional diplomacy or emotional politics has a significance beyond what the individual leader or leaders may or may not be actually feeling. And for scholars of political science, they're on much safer ground dealing with that, because the political discourse, the emotional discourse, is easy to detect. And then the question is, why are they projecting this kind of emotional discourse? The best example, by the way, is Germany after World War II, to get to Ori, to get to your specialty, the emotional politics of guilt. I mean, who knows what these people are really feeling, but they feel a need to perform a politics of guilt in order to be reintegrated into the international community after World War II.
Yeah, this just shows how emotions and the representation of emotions are so central to, to everything, to diplomacy, to international relations. Yes, Sarah.
Oh, I actually wanted to take us back to a specific moment in your talk, the Nasser memoir versus the Nasser pamphlet, and how I thought that was really fascinating that you have this one moment that's really created into sort of a moral tale in one instance with a completely different valence as it's presented in the memoir. And I guess I was wondering, uh, just a little bit more context to that. Why did the daughter decide to publish the memoir? Did it bother her that there was any difference? Did anybody in the Arab world pick up on this and make any note of it? It seemed like a really radical difference in interpretation there.
It's interesting. I don't know. I don't know. I think it was an act of filial piety on her part to reproduce the words of her father, a great Arab leader. And she might not. I really don't know if she was even aware of the difference between the published and the unpublished writing. It reminds me of something. Before working on emotion, I was working on a biography of Theodor Herzl, who in his diaries wrote some things that today would seem extremely cringeworthy. And what's interesting is that when his diaries were first published in the 1920s, all the cringeworthy stuff by our standards today was left in. But a bunch of other stuff was taken out. What was taken out were things that would have not bothered us one whit today. But it was things where he was making snide comments about certain other Zionist figures who were still alive. So they cut that out. But they left in, racist comments and misogynist comments and stuff that today would get us quite upset. And I remember talking with the man who sort of edited then the unpublished, or sorry, completely unexpurgated diary. And he just said he had an obligation, kind of a scholarly obligation, just to get it all out there to the world. But it might very well be that she wasn't even aware of it. I don't know. I need to ask Eli Podeh about this. He's a scholar who's worked quite a bit about Arab world in the 1950s and its relationships with Israel. So if I find out, I'll let you know.
Thank you. And do you know if anybody still reads it today?
Reads which?
The memoir?
Well, you mean Nasser's memoir?
Yeah.
Well, I think so. And what happened was, like almost everything really important that was published in English in the 1970s and 80s, it was the work of Walid Khalidi. So Walid translated it with a lengthy introduction, very helpful, and I think it was in the Journal of Palestine Studies. So it's been out there, and I think that pretty much any book about the 1948 war will bring in either that document probably more often than the published pamphlet. And I don't know why, because the published pamphlet's also available, but probably because it was in the Journal of Palestine Studies. It's the kind of thing scholars turn to easily. But yeah, I think any book on 48 would make a reference to that. And Nasser's anger, sort of the anger at the Arab states for, and this goes back to Betty Morris's early work from the late 1980s, that the Arab states held back, that they held back many of their troops, that they didn't really want an independent Palestine because they didn't want a state that would actually be anti-Western and so forth. Yeah, I think that this is a pretty commonly cited source, but I don't think anyone has juxtaposed it with the actual unpublished diary.
I just want to say we have a clarification about the question of Smotrich.
Oh
Smotrich,
yeah, what do you say?
apparently he cried during his speech today. So I don't know what he said, but he cried in his speech. So I mean, talking about the emotions of politicians. Yeah.
Oh, so he has tear ducts. That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, obviously, crying can be entirely naive. That is, it can be entirely spontaneous and sincere. But even crying can be manipulative. I mean, there's a scene there was a moment when Chaim Weizmann met Balfour, and Weizmann told Balfour all about the suffering of the Jewish peoples. This is like in 1914. It's very early on in their acquaintance, and Balfour starts to cry. I think he was moved. He was moved and he cried. There's a great article by Jim Leffler called "When Hermann Cohen Cried," which is about an encounter between the Zionist folklorist Zvi Edelson and the great German Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen. And Edelson plays something on the piano for him, and Cohen cries and almost faints in a kind of ecstatic state. That's completely sincere. So it may be, I mean, I don't know, was it perhaps about martyrs, maybe a martyrology for Jewish victims? Was it? Because I would think that I can imagine one of two things leading someone like him to cry. One would be a sense of mourning, grief, and then for the Jewish dead, and then anger and hatred towards their killers. And the other would be tears of joy over the expansion of Israel, settlement of Gaza, and so forth. I mean, that would be my guess, is that the tears would be one or the other. Or he stepped on a rock. I mean, that's also a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I know he cried when he visited one of the kibbutzim that were attacked on October 7th a few days ago. I don't know about today's speech. I'll check it.
Well, and then you don't know. I mean, that may be completely sincere. I mean, the fact is, it was a horrible massacre, and I can just, I mean, I've seen the film footage. I can't imagine what it'd be like to have seen it in real life. I can only think of the Hebrew verb, mizazea, right? It's just absolutely horrific. And so it would be kind of odd, frankly, if a human being in that situation didn't cry if they had sympathy for Jews and for Israel. There are a lot of people who looked at that and didn't cry because they didn't have sympathy. They had antipathy to Jews and Israel. So that's not so surprising.
Yeah. I want to take us back to the history of 1948 and ask a more specific question about a specific emotion about fear. So fear is often mentioned in the context of Arab displacement, right? Some Palestinians escaped because of fear. Those who were not, directly driven out or expelled by Jewish
Right.
forces. Is there also a sense of fear? I mean, how important fear was also on the other side? I mean, expelling Arabs out of fear, or Jews fighting out of fear. What was the role of fear in the among the IDF or Haganah fighting in 1948?
It's interesting. What the IDF tried to do in 48 is they tried to instill into the fighters, and again, these weren't trained soldiers, but come to think of it, the kids who fought for the U.S. Army in 1940 in World War II were just a bunch of kids. So it's all pretty much the same. The armies try to instill into the fighters a sense of accepting fear, not denying it, and then not being conquered by it. There is I forget now the name of the American Jewish psychologist who worked on this and wrote a pamphlet during World War II about on fear, and it was translated into Hebrew, Ala Pachad Bikrav, and I actually have the pamphlet somewhere here in my office. Um, and it's like, chapter 1, recognize your fear. Of course, you're afraid. You don't want to get killed. Here's the things you can do in battle to maximize your chances. Here and so just to try to control it and um, uh, to canalize, in other words, to channel it. That's it, to channel it. Um, it was very unusual in 1948, and this is from Shai Haskani's book. Very unusual in 1948 for the IDF training materials to just emphasize like total fear and total rage. Like they're going to kill us, total fear, and therefore you have to destroy them, total rage. The exception was Abba Kovner, the ghetto survivor who did write manuals for the IDF that were filled with both fear and hatred and rage. But by and large, the attempt was to create the ideal soldier is something of a machine. And it's not the machine that does not admit feelings, but learns how to grapple with them. So the IDF, they talk quite openly about fear. And if anyone's interested in the pamphlet, who reads Hebrew, I'm happy to, I think I have it on my computer. I'm happy to send it to you. And then the other issue is that of civilian morale. And I've talked with Anita Shapira about this just based on my own research, and she seems to agree that in 1948, there is a feeling of desperation, and with desperation comes a kind of calm. It's something that Natan Alterman wrote about beautifully during the days of the German advance across North Africa, as it looked like the Yishuv might be, might be conquered. And he writes about that kind of steady calm when you really have nothing else to there's no other choice except to stay and possibly to fight. I don't know how representative it is, but the Haganah did do public opinion surveys in 1948 that I found in the Haganah archive, which evidently I think somebody had written that they'd gotten lost, but I found them, which was kind of fun. And they do suggest fairly high morale. On the other hand, the Haganah sampling techniques were not great, and maybe they were just writing things that they wanted to believe or they wanted someone to hear. But I think there was, in general, a sense, aside from a minority of Israelis, and you know more about this than me, or the people who didn't want to be part of this and who suffered and wanted to get the hell out. I think that by and large, people in the new state of Israel just realized that they had no choice. I mean, maybe that's the big difference, is that Arabs, as horrible as the Nakba was, I mean, they were forced from their homes one way or the other, but they did have somewhere to go. And the Jews had nowhere to go. So they had to fight. And so that's at least the emotion that is communicated publicly and that is communicated in these surveys. On the other hand, in private life, there might very well have been, absolute panic and people completely falling apart and, nervous breakdowns and the like. It's something that Yoram Kaniok captured in his novel Tashach, where the soldier is in a complete state of psychological disassociation. And that's completely possible. I'm just talking about the public texts that are available to me that suggest a sort of controlled fear.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think that we will end with that, right? It's already 5:30. So I want to thank you so much, Derek, for this really great talk and for answering the questions. And we want to thank everyone who participated and sent us questions. Sarah or Bruno, do you want to say something?
Thank you so much,
Thank you
sir.
very
That
much.
was absolutely wonderful.
Thank
Very
you.
much
It was a pleasure.
appreciated.
It was a pleasure. Next time in Columbus.
That sounds great.
Okay.
And thank you to everybody who came to participate in this today.
Thank you all. Be well.